Wind is the third case when the direction in which the fuselage is pointing does not truly indicate the direction of flight of an aircraft. The effect of wind on an airborne object is to carry it to leeward at the same speed as the wind itself, like this barrage balloon if it breaks adrift. The same thing happens to an aircraft. Its fuselage may be pointing in a certain direction, and it may have a certain airspeed in that direction, but all the time it is being carried bodily downwind, like this. When viewing an aircraft through your gun sight, you know that you have to judge the aim off from the appearance of the aircraft and your knowledge of its airspeed. You must still do so if the wind is blowing. But it is obvious that in order to hit the aircraft, you must aim to leeward of where you would have done had no wind been blowing. Let us take a bird's eye view of three cases. There is an aircraft at P and it's pointing along this line, but owing to the wind, it will actually travel in this direction, its future position being here. If your ship or gun position were down here, the aircraft at P would be pointing straight at you, but would actually be moving to your left. From your own ship, it would look like this. If your ship was on the left here, the aircraft at P would be pointing to your right, but would actually be coming straight towards you. This is what you would see. The aircraft crabbing towards you. This is rather a special case. The general case is if your ship were over here on the right. The aircraft is already pointing to your left, but because of wind, it will actually move further to your left than the direction of the fuselage might lead you to suppose. The gunner would see this, and obviously to hit the target, he must aim to leeward of where he would have done had no wind been blowing. This is sheer common sense. Think of the balloon. Before explaining how much allowance to make for wind and how to make this allowance, I want you to consider 2 points. The first is the effect of own speed. Here is a ship steaming along with the gun's crew closed up. Obviously, the speed of own ship in this direction will be imparted to the projectile as it leaves the muzzle of the gun. This must be allowed for. But fortunately, the true wind is modified by own ship speed, and you feel an apparent wind which is not the same as the true wind. If you use this wind you feel in deciding how much wind allowance to make, you automatically correct for the effect of own speed on the projectile. So much for the first point, effect of own speed. Use apparent wind and you'll be all right. This fellow's just testing the wind he feels. The second point is the direction of apparent wind relative to the line of sight. If the apparent wind is at right angles to the line of sight, the aircraft will be blown sideways to this point during the time of flight of the projectile. If, however, the apparent wind, though the same strength as before, was in this direction, the aircraft would be blown down here during the time of flight. Thus it would only be carried sideways this amount as compared with this amount in the first case. That is because the apparent wind in this direction is not blowing across so much as in this direction. Therefore, it's the strength of the apparent wind across which determines how much the target appears to be blown sideways. This is the first case. Here is the second case, with the same strength of apparent wind, but not blowing across so much. This brings us to the straightforward rule for wind allowance. Aim to leeward, allowing for 2/3 of the strength of the apparent wind across. Why only 2/3? Why not the full strength? Because the projectile is also carried downwind a bit, but nothing like so much as the aircraft. Therefore, if the apparent wind is 15 knots directly across the line of sight, that is a moderate wind, allow a 10-knot correction. If the apparent wind is 30 knots directly across the line of sight, that's a strong wind, allow a 20-knot correction, and so on, allowing 2/3 of the apparent wind across. Having learnt the rules, how are we going to apply the necessary wind correction? Viewed through your sight, you assess the aircraft in the normal manner of having a certain aim or speed in a certain direction. The center of the sight shows where the gun is pointing. To allow for a strong wind across in this direction, we want the gun pointed, say, 20 knots to leeward. We can do this by imagining a point along this horizontal bar, 20 knots to windward of the center, and make the aircraft fly towards this point instead of the center. This obviously makes the gun point 20 knots to leeward. So you see that by selecting a point the required number of knots to windward of the center, the gun is actually aimed to leeward by that amount. If the wind across is 20 knots in this direction, you would select your point about 14 knots to windward and thus aim your gun to leeward the right amount. At two-man guns, layer and trainer must agree beforehand on the allowance to be made for the apparent wind across, so that each is thinking of the same point as the imaginary center of his sight, and they can therefore cooperate in making the correct wind allowance.
Here, Arthur, Mo. That's all very fine, but how's a bloke to think of all this when he's being attacked? Now, when I was in Norway...
Yes, I know. When you were in Norway, you found it was too late to make nice wind calculations when the enemy was in sight. And that is precisely why you must always act as follows.
This is what you should do on all occasions of closing up. Here's your ship, and here's your gun. We'll suppose it has this arc of fire. You close up, and at once you note the strength and direction of the wind you feel. The air defense officer, or in small ships the officer of the watch, should pass through this, but you must be prepared to make your own estimate. We'll say it's 30 knots, a strong wind. Now divide your arc of fire up into convenient sectors. For most guns, they'll be bow, beam, and quarter, and decide how much wind across to allow for in each sector. On the bow, you're firing into the wind. No sideways allowance necessary. In this sector here on the beam, the wind is more across, about 15 knots. And on the quarter here, the apparent wind is blowing almost directly across, 30 knots. Knowing the wind across, memorize the allowance you're going to make when afterwards engaging targets in these sectors. On the bow, no allowance. Beam, 10 knots, quarter, 20 knots, 2/3 in each case. Here's one coming in on the beam. You know at once that in this sector you're going to allow a 10-knot correction because you've thought it out beforehand. Don't forget, however, that if your own ship alters course, you must think again. The wind you feel is going to be different, and the allowances necessary on bow, beam, and quarter are quite different. You'll notice that even on a flat, calm day, a low-level bomber has to allow for the speed of his target so as to come in on a steady bearing. But you, having gauged the wind you feel, will allow for this. Here he is coming in. The gunner's allowing about 15 knots. He knew his apparent wind allowance and was ready for all attacks.
Yes, but what about attacks up or downwind? When I was in Norway...
You're quite right. You've done it again. When you were in Norway, the aircraft always preferred to attack up or downwind, didn't he?
Definitely. Of course he did. It makes his bombing more accurate.
That's it. And if you want to hit him, you must apply exactly the same rules as before. Now look.
Let's have a quiet glance at this. It's only common sense. Here's the ship, and here for the moment is the aircraft approaching. The blob indicates its future position, and if there were no wind, if you aimed there, you'd hit it. But if the wind is behind the aircraft, it will increase its rate of approach, and more up-aim off will be required. So you'd aim here. This is, after all, only aiming to leeward as before. Conversely, if the aircraft is flying into a headwind, you'd aim here, less up-aim off required. In the case of a dive bomber, momentarily in this position, with the wind behind it, the aircraft will be carried forward like this, rather as though there were an extra lift effect, obviously more up-aim off required. Have a look at it through the sight. See him taking more up-aim off to allow for lift and wind, because the wind's behind the aircraft in this case. Note that when targets are downwind or upwind, it is the angle of sight which affects the wind allowance necessary for a given wind speed. With the aircraft up here, the allowance for wind is greater than with the target down here, although the wind is the same. Both aircraft are blown the same amount, but the effective wind is that much as compared with that much. This is because the higher the angle of sight, the more the wind is across the line of fire in a vertical direction. Down here, the wind across in a vertical direction is very slight, and so wind allowance is almost nil. But up here, you'd allow for the full strength of the wind, using the same rule as before. Aim to leeward 2/3 of the wind speed. Remember then that as the target approaches upwind or downwind, you start making little allowance for wind. The right-hand picture shows wind allowance being taken, left-hand picture not being taken. This is a 200-knot aircraft, parent wind 30 knots. As the angle of sight gets higher, allow more and more, until with the target right overhead, you're allowing 20 knots more. So much for banking. Don't forget to forecast. Diving aircraft, don't forget to allow for lifts. And wind, don't be caught napping. Have your allowance ready beforehand. And when in doubt, allow 10 knots to leeward for a light wind and 20 knots to leeward for a strong wind.